Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Last year, the Alberta government passed legislation making it easier to hold referendums. This includes holding a referendum on separating from the rest of Canada, which has been gathering steam. But many First Nations have been speaking out against such a proposed referendum, saying it would violate their treaty rights. APTN reporter Leanne Sanders has been following the story closely, and she joins me today from Saskatoon. So welcome to Nation to Nation, Leanne.
All right, thanks for having me, Fraser.
Good. So I guess I'll start off. I know the latest, I understand the number of First Nations recently held a vote of non-confidence in the government. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Their vote specifically would be mainly symbolic, but what they are asking is that any opposition MLAs, anybody that's independent, to stand up and say to the Premier that this is not a good thing and they want to pass a non-confidence motion to let the Premier know that this is a no-go issue.
Okay, we talked a little bit about it in the lead up, but the what is the changes that this legislation makes that makes it, I suppose, easier to hold a referendum? Maybe you can just explain to our viewers a little bit about that.
So last summer in July, the UCP government introduced changes to the Referendum Act, and specifically they introduced changes that would make it easier for citizens who wanted to have a question on separation added to a referendum, made it easier for them to mount those petitions. So basically, they had to gather fewer signatures. In this case, 177,000, a little bit over that, to force it to be included. And they had a longer length of time to have those signatures gathered. So basically, a couple things that changed, just that seemed to pave the way for a separatist question to be included on a referendum.
Okay, and I understand like before they would have to actually do this in the legislature, right? Have a vote and have it passed through but that's no longer the case. It can be done entirely outside the legislature. That's right.
Yeah, so the referendum would be a totally separate thing, and as long as they get the required number of signatures, and um, then that could go ahead.
So I've been watching on the news. I know that the pro separatist group has been out there having a lot of town hall meetings and getting signatures. Is this something that could likely become a reality in the near future that they get enough and that this referendum goes ahead?
Well, the separatists have been loud and, they've been very vocal since the start. But there are others who have mounted petitions to stay in Canada, for Alberta to remain a part of Canada. And that actually has been the only successful citizen-led petition at this point. It has been certified by the Chief Electoral Officer in Alberta. So at this point, that is the only one that has gotten the required number of signatures within the required amount of time. So it's hard to say, and I can't speculate on where those are at this point. I mean, the polling suggests, things are not as rosy as the separatists are making out, but they are continuing their efforts. There have been town halls, as you mentioned. And again, the turnout at those events has been a little bit variable in the media sources that have been reporting on it. So it's really hard to tell, I guess, unless you're actually there, who is saying what and how many.
And maybe you could just talk a little bit about the First Nations opposition to this. I've only seen First Nations that are against so far. I haven't seen any that are for the process. But I think they're against the separation. But I think they're against the process and how it alters the treaty relationship. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the relationship that the First Nations chiefs have had with the premier has not been great prior to this because of consultation issues. Obviously, with UNDRIP, the free, prior, and informed consent, any changes that could affect them, they need to be discussed. But even in projects concerning the oil sands, energy development, that kind of thing that is on First Nations or treaty land, they have not been consulted. And there are a number of other projects in different areas where they also feel they're not being properly consulted. So all of this bad blood maybe predates the separation question. And then, of course, the separation itself, that question, it crosses a lot of different constitutional boundaries and raises a lot of uncertainty across the country.
Now I know that the media has covered these sort of the First Nations also opposition to the referendum and the process of the question, and of course the government will come back and just kind of have a generic statement that they support Section 35 rights. But in reality, has the Premier done anything in recent months to sort of reach out to First Nations and explain the process, or that their rights will be respected, or has it just been has there been any change at all from the government?
As far as I'm aware, no. There may have been some private meetings, but it has not been made public as far as I'm aware. They do seem to rely on their economic development. There is a body in Alberta that, advises on issues related to economic development, and that seems to be where the Premier feels that consultation has happened when they proceed to that body. But as far as with saying to the chiefs, what are your thoughts on this and where do you stand? I don't believe that's happened. I think Alberta has a general perception that too much of their wealth goes to the east, and so they want to keep that in Alberta.
So, well, obviously, lots to talk about. I'm sure it's keeping you busy. Unfortunately, for time purposes, we'll have to end it there. But thanks very much for talking to us, Leanne, and keep up the great work.
All right, thanks very much, Fraser.
After the break, we'll talk to First Nations Child and Family Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock about the federal government's recent funding announcement on Jordan's Principle.
This investment reflects the needs that we have seen over the last decade, and it will ensure that children continue to have the essential services that they need.
Welcome back. Last week, the federal government announced $1.6 billion in new funding for Jordan's Principle, which is supposed to carry the program through to March 2027. But critics say it is not enough to address the enormous backlog of applications, nor provide a sustainable funding model so that First Nations children can receive the services they need in a timely fashion. Joining me today to talk about the latest announcement on Jordan's Principle is First Nations Child and Family Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock. She joins me from Kamloops, British Columbia. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Cindy.
Thanks for having me.
So I know that this deal was announced this new funding was announced last week, but not everybody's happy with it, of course. Can you tell our viewers what you think of last week's announcement and why maybe it does miss the mark?
Well, it misses the mark because there was no consultation leading up to it. It's a fixed amount, and Jordan's Principle is a legal requirement for government to meet the needs that professionals, elders, and knowledge keepers say children have. So it really shouldn't be a capped amount. And then the second big thing, and you pointed to it, is Canada was legally ordered to address all the cases that it hadn't opened or addressed. They're called the backlog. And they were ordered to do that last December, like December of 2024, pardon me. And they still have not done it. And what was missing out of that is any kind of announcement about what the department is going to do to actually come into compliance with the law. And when they break the law, children get hurt. So that's my worry.
Yes, and I guess that brings us back to, and we've of course discussed this before, but what does the government really need to do to address this enormous backlog and to maybe create a sustainable model of funding so that the expectations are met on the program?
Well, the federal government is one with the legal obligation to process the cases in a timely way. So they're responsible for creating the backlog and perpetuating it. We say that actually they should give amnesty and just approve those cases in the backlog. We know, Fraser, for individual cases, it would cost them $43 million to do that. It could be life-changing and life-saving for kids. Do that, clear the decks, and then work with First Nations and with First Nations experts and the parties at the tribunal to do a process on an ongoing basis. The other thing they need to do is set very simple things like make an online intake form that then can track those requests going through so that we can make sure that children aren't falling through the administrative gaps. These basic good management practices are missing from the department.
Okay, and I guess we've had different numbers, but what, by your estimates, what is the backlog number at right now as we speak?
Well, the best reliable evidence is when one of the federal government's top officials testified under oath about a month ago. And in that testimony, he claimed there were at least 130,000 requests in the backlog. 130,000.
Well, that's a significant number that, yeah, which just shows kind of how far behind I guess the federal government is on these applications.
That's it. And what we're worried about with these numbers that they throw out there is that they're creating a situation where children's needs aren't going to get met because they're not even opening the cases. And then they look back at the figures and they say, well, we only spent 1.2 or whatever last year, and so this is actually an improvement. No, like that's the problem is they can lower the floor artificially in ways that, try to look publicly like they're doing the right thing.
Now, I want to move to another topic, and that, of course, was the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation were in, or at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal last week, seeking approval for their long-term agreement on First Nations child welfare reform that they signed last year. I know that your organization and the National Children's Chiefs Commission have kind of taken a different direction on this. Are they headed in the right direction trying to seek approval or provincial or what's your thoughts on that?
Well, at last week's hearing, what was at issue was Canada's discrimination. Has Canada done enough to stop its discrimination in Ontario and make sure it never happens again? And we have serious concerns about that. We have concerns because the agreement is only for another 7 years. There's no binding thing at all to hold Canada accountable to stop discriminating against First Nations children in Ontario after that. And the legal orders from the tribunal, they want to get rid of all of them. And that means there would be very little protection for these kids. And the families and First Nations would be back at square one when we started this case. That's not something that we would like to see. The other thing that we're concerned about is that Canada has been positioning this as a step forward for self-government. And while we appreciate that leadership will be able to make some decisions about the money in their community, they actually get zero decisions on a major package of the funding, how much the funding is, who's eligible, how does the money flow, all that, those decisions are really in the hands of Canada ultimately. And we have a concern about that because Canada is the discriminator.
Now, with your organization, the National Children's Chiefs Commission, sort of heading obviously in a different direction, wanting a national agreement, which is kind of what was tasked a couple of years ago at the AFN, and then, but the Chiefs of Ontario now want to pursue this agreement. How do you think you could bring everyone together in a national deal, I guess, at this point?
Well, I mean, we're not saying that the Chiefs of Ontario have to take the loving justice model, which is the First Nations led model for the rest of the country at all. What we're saying is that whatever Canada does, it has to meet that minimum bar of stop discriminating. And what we've seen far too often is that Canada will try to reach deals that actually go below those minimum standards. And that's not something that we want to see, at least for the Caring Society. I can't speak for the National Children's Chiefs Commission.
Okay, and on another issue, of course, both federal government and uh, your organization, National Children's Chiefs Commission, submitted their plans for long-term reform to the tribunal last December. And we haven't followed much since, but is there any updates recently that you can provide us or anything that's happened since you submitted your plan?
Yeah, well, we're waiting for some dates to be set down by the tribunal. But one of the things that was kind of disappointing is that We were encouraged by Minister Gulmasty's announcement on the day they filed their own plan that they would be willing to sit down with us and see where there could be some kind of joint plan that might emerge from Loving Justice and their plan. Certainly, we got to work right away evaluating Canada's plan. And only to have the Department of Justice say in January that they're not looking at Loving Justice. They don't want to look at the First Nations-led plan. It's their way or the highway, and as far as they're concerned. And that really is out of alignment with what the tribunal orders are. It's out of alignment with UNDRIP and raises serious concerns about where the government is going on this, because their plan has some real shortcomings.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we'll have to end it there for time purposes, but as always, a pleasure to have you on the show, and thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, we'll talk to Sean Longboat, who is the CEO of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, about the impacts federal budget cuts are having on these organizations. Welcome back. Indigenous Friendship Centres in Ontario say they're struggling due to cuts announced in last November's federal budget. With some program funding set to expire this spring, time is of the essence. Sean Longboat is the Executive Director of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. He joins me today from Toronto to talk about the situation. So welcome to Nation, Sean.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Great. So I guess we've heard different things, but maybe could you first tell our viewers about how big the funding cuts are and how they're affecting you right now?
Yeah, sure. So we understand that there will be a 50%, over 50% reduction to core funding to friendship centers. Friendship centers have been doing work across the country for over 70 years. So they're an institution in this country, and cutting them right now is irresponsible. We are calling on the federal government to change course and continue to invest over the long term into friendship centers.
And I assume you get funding from the Ontario government as well. What's the breakdown exactly in terms of funding from the Ontario government and the federal government?
Yeah, we're really talking about core funding here, and so the only core funding stream that exists for friendship centers today comes from the federal government. Of course, friendship centers and urban Indigenous people operate in the province of Ontario. They also operate across the country as well. And so we do partner with Ontario across many systems, including in education, in health, and in employment. But what we're talking about is federal core funding through the Urban Programming for Indigenous Peoples program, and that's the program that's been cut by over half.
Okay, and then I know this is a question I always get, and it's not maybe easy to answer, but how will this impact programming and potentially staffing levels if it doesn't change?
Well, it's going to impact friendship centers enormously. When you cut programming in half, you get half the services. It could mean a reduction in operating hours. It could mean that vulnerable people are not getting the supports that they need. So friendship centers provide wraparound services to community members, from youth to elders, to people experiencing homelessness. Those are the people that I'm worried about. These cuts will impact them the most.
Okay, and we talked a little bit about it in the lead-up, but there was an announcement by the ISC Minister Mandy Gulmasty last week on Jordan's Principle, but she was asked about cuts to friendship centers and seemed to indicate there's an announcement on its way. What have you heard about this, or what kind of contact have you had with the federal government on this situation?
We haven't received official correspondence about any change. Again, we've heard that there will be cuts. There was no new funding in the federal budget. We have been told that the Government of Canada intends to continue to work alongside of us as partners. They are committed to reconciliation. However, actions will speak louder than words. And so we look forward to the minister's announcement and what it could mean for increased investments into friendship centers. As I said, friendship centers are a legacy program in this country. They've been doing work for over 70 years, and by destabilizing friendship centers, you're destabilizing institutions that have been supporting communities for decades, providing wraparound supports, and helping people to improve the quality of life. Our mission is to achieve intergenerational prosperity. And by cutting programs, we're going to be in a position where results become much more difficult to achieve.
Now, regardless, it's been a few different, like Jordan's principal funding was not announced. It was just announced last week. I think I mentioned to you in the lead up also the Inuit Child First Initiative. There was funding announced for that later after the budget. But regardless of if funding does come, I imagine this must make it difficult for you to do your planning when you don't really know what funding is coming and when, and it coming at the last minute, sort of in the spring.
Yeah, let me put it this way. With sufficient and stable core funding, we can strategically plan. We can look to the future and achieve better outcomes for community. But when funding is unpredictable, when it's unstable, we're going to be in a precarious position, and we can't plan. We're in a position where we're managing chaos and managing crisis. So we would like to encourage the federal government to invest meaningfully over the long term so that we can achieve long-term results for communities. What's good for urban Indigenous communities is good for the country. When urban Indigenous communities are thriving, Canada benefits as well.
Now, I know that friendship centers provide in big urban cities like where you are in Toronto and places like Ottawa, Vancouver, number of services, too many probably to mention. They're a meeting place for people, but I know that probably they've become more essential over the last few years just with things going on since the pandemic and that. Can you tell me sort of the needs that you're seeing for Indigenous people in these urban settings that maybe haven't seen before or are increasing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will state that the Friendship Center movement was integral in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Increasingly, friendship centers are playing a role in emergency management and emergency preparedness. But friendship centers have been providing wraparound supports as part of our service delivery model for decades, and that consists of mental health supports, housing navigation, employment supports, as well as family well-being, among others. The need is increasing because the population is increasing. Affordability is a major concern. The opioid epidemic, as well as the overall cost of living, including housing, are things that we're concerned about, and I know communities are concerned about as well. Friendship centers have been at the front line of service delivery for a long time, and we're seeing an increasing need for services, but we're also seeing population growth. We are the fastest growing demographic in Canadian society. In Ontario specifically, over 88% of Indigenous people live in cities and towns, and so the needs are significant. And again, without sufficient funding, communities will be impacted pretty significantly.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there for time purposes, but thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.